In the final dry weeks before the first hard frosts crept down out of the Bighorns and across the Powder River country of eastern Wyoming, while every other rancher in the valley was busy with the sensible work of late summer, cutting hay, mending fence line, dragging stock tanks closer to the winter pens, Barbara Halstead was doing something else entirely. She was down on her knees in the dirt, planting flowers. At least, that was what it looked like from the road. Day after day, from the first pink of dawn until the sun sat heavy on the mountains, she worked a long trowel into the hard soil around her cattle pens and along the low limestone foundation of the ranch house, tucking small green cuttings into the ground in careful, measured spacing. Tansy along the corral posts, wormwood beneath the hay barn eaves, rue in tight bands around the calving shed, pennyroyal creeping close against the kitchen wall and the smokehouse door. Nothing about the pattern looked random. Inside the ranch house were only her two children, 12-year-old Etta and 7-year-old Samuel, who carried water buckets and cuttings for her in the sun until their hands went green at the fingertips. Cowhands riding in from the northern grazing sections would slow their horses just to stare. Some laughed openly. Others tipped their hats and rode on quickly, the way men ride past a woman they have decided has taken leave of her mind. Word traveled fast in the valley. By the second week of planting, half the ranchers between the Belle Fourche and the Cheyenne had heard that the Halstead widow was planting poison around her herd, because that was the part no one could understand. Every hand who had worked cattle for more than a season knew Tansy could bloat a cow. Knew wormwood turned milk bitter and left calves staggering. Knew pennyroyal in the wrong quantity could drop a heifer where she stood. And Barbara Halstead, they whispered, was ringing her own pens with the stuff on purpose. To them, it did not look like ranching. It looked like a woman quietly gambling her whole herd, her whole living, her children's inheritance, on some notion nobody could see the shape of. And if she was wrong, the coming winter would offer no mercy for that mistake. What secret did those narrow green borders hold? Would Barbara's strange garden become the salvation of her ranch, or the grave of everything her husband had built? Subscribe now to witness how one widow's forbidden almanac would rewrite the fate of an entire Wyoming valley. Frank Halstead had been dead nearly a year and a half by then. Killed in a stampede outside Lusk the previous spring, trampled beneath his own steers when a lightning strike broke a night herd loose across the flats. They brought him home wrapped in oilcloth in the back of a buckboard, and Barbara had buried him on the small rise east of the house where the sagebrush thinned into buffalo grass. 90 head of cattle came with the ranch. So did a mortgage held by the Farmers and Drovers Bank in Cheyenne. So did the low, steady expectation from every man in the valley that she would sell before winter and go back east to her people. She had not sold. She had instead sent to Omaha for a crate of seed and root cuttings. And now the whole valley was watching, waiting for the widow's foolishness to prove itself. The foreman's name was George Kettering, and he had been working Halstead cattle since before Etta was born. He was a lean, sun-cured man in his early 40s, half German on his mother's side, with the kind of quiet, patient competence that comes from 20 winters of watching other men make expensive mistakes. Frank had trusted him with the whole North Range. Barbara, after Frank died, had asked him plainly whether he intended to stay on, and George had taken his hat off in the yard and said, "Yes, ma'am, as long as you'll have me." That had been the entire conversation. Neither of them had spoken of Frank since. But on the third morning of the herb planting, George rode down from the upper pastures with a jaw set hard enough that Barbara could see it from the porch. He swung down at the corral, tied his horse without hurry, and walked over to where she was working a row of pennyroyal into the ground beside the calving shed. He did not raise his voice. George never raised his voice. He simply crouched down beside her in the dirt, took one of the small green sprigs between his fingers and turned it slowly. "Mrs. Halstead," he said, "you know what this is." "I know what it is, George. And the tansy yonder. And that gray-leafed brush by the barn. I know all of it." He was quiet a long moment, rolling the pennyroyal leaf between his thumb and forefinger. The smell came up sharp and bright between them, mint-sweet, and something underneath it, something that made the nose sting. From the far pen, a heifer lowed once and went quiet. "A cow will eat near anything she can reach through a rail," George said. "You know that too. Come January, when the grass is under snow and she's chewing at the fence posts because she's bored and hungry, she'll pull that tansy right through the boards. Wormhood's worse. I seen a steer down in Nebraska go blind from wormhood in the hay. Just blind, standing there, walking in a circle till his owner shot him." Barbara set the trowel down carefully in the dirt. She did not look at George. She looked at the small green sprig still turning in his fingers. "I know," she said. "Then plow it under, ma'am, before the frost kills what you planted anyway. I'll do it myself. I won't say a word to anybody. We'll say it was clover that didn't take." No, the silence that followed was not angry. It was worse than angry. It was the silence of a good man who has begun, for the first time, to wonder whether the woman paying his wages is competent to keep him employed. Barbara felt it settle on her shoulders like a wet coat. She picked up the trowel again and pressed another cutting into the ground. "George," she said, "I am asking you to trust me until the first thaw. If I have lost cattle by the first thaw, you may plow it all under yourself and I will pay you double for the week you spend doing it. Until then, I need you to keep the hands out of these borders. No trampling, no pulling, and no burning." He stood up slowly. She could feel him looking down at her at the crown of her head where the sun struck her hair. He did not answer for a long time. "Yes, ma'am," he finally said, "until the first thaw." Then he walked back to his horse and rode north toward the upper pastures without looking back once. Word of that exchange traveled the valley before George's horse reached the north gate. By evening it had been passed at 3 separate suppers and 1 bunkhouse, and by the following Sunday it had crossed the pulpit steps of the little clapboard Methodist church in Sundance, where old Reverend Coombs stood with his hat in his hand after service, and gently asked Barbara if perhaps she might come sit a while with his wife, who had, he said, a great deal of practical experience with kitchen gardens. Barbara had smiled at him the way a woman smiles at a well-meaning child, thanked him for the invitation, and driven her buckboard home without stopping in town for the salt she needed. She was not unaware of what people were saying. She heard it in the pauses that opened when she walked into the general store. She heard it in the way Mrs. Ellery Winch, whose husband ran the biggest outfit east of the river, crossed the street rather than speak to her outside the post office. She heard it in the too loud cheerfulness of the 2 younger hands, Pete Moll and Danish Sorensen, who took their meals at the ranch house kitchen table and had begun, subtly, to stop asking her questions about the coming winter's plans. Only Etta, who was 12 and sharp-eyed, and had inherited her father's gift for reading a room, said anything out loud. She said it one night while she was drying the supper dishes and Barbara was banking the stove for morning. "Mama," she said, "Mr. Kettering thinks you've gone soft in the head." Barbara did not turn around. "Mr. Kettering," she said, "thinks I am grieving badly and making a bad decision because of it. That is a kinder thing to think than what some of the others think." "What do the others think, Etta? I want to know." Barbara set the stove lid down carefully and turned. Her daughter was standing with a wet plate in one hand and a dish towel in the other, and her face had the still, waiting look of a child who has decided she is finished being told half answers. Barbara took a slow breath. "Some of them think I am trying to lose the ranch on purpose," she said, "so that I will have to sell it and go back to my father in Ohio. Some of them think I have taken up with strange ideas because a woman alone has nothing to steady her mind. And 1 or 2, I imagine, think I am simply not very intelligent." Etta considered this for a moment. "Are any of those true?" "No." "Then why are you doing it?" Barbara looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she crossed the kitchen and knelt down in front of the flour bin in the corner, the tall tin one with the dented lid that had come with them from Ohio when Etta was still a baby. She lifted the lid, reached down past the white flour and the little cotton sack of soda, and drew out a small, flat, oilcloth-wrapped bundle that had been resting at the bottom for as long as Etta could remember. She set it on the kitchen table between them. "Sit down," she said. Etta sat. Barbara unwrapped the oilcloth slowly. Inside was a book, no bigger than a family Bible but thinner, bound in brown leather worn soft at the corners, the spine cracked in 2 places and mended with dark thread. The cover had no title. When Barbara opened it, the pages were the color of weak tea, and the writing that filled them, line after careful line, was in a spidery German hand. Etta stared at the book for a long moment without touching it. She had seen her mother's hands go into that flour tin 1,000 times and never once had anything come out but flour. The realization settled on her slowly, the way a shadow moves across a floor. "That's been in there my whole life," she said. "Longer than that." "Whose is it?" "My grandmother's. Your great-grandmother. Her name was Katharina Roos, and she was born in a village called Oberammergau in the mountains south of Munich in the last year of the century before this one. She wrote in this book from the time she was 14 until the year she died. My mother carried it across the ocean in the winter of 1852 in a wooden trunk with a broken hinge, and she gave it to me on the day I married your father." Etta touched the edge of a page very carefully, as though it might crumble under her fingers. "Can you read it?" "Some. Not all. My German is kitchen German, and hers is old and full of words that even the pastor in Cincinnati could not always translate. But the parts I need, I know. She kept a farmer's almanac in the back half, weather signs, cures for scours in a milk cow, what to feed a hen that has stopped laying, and in the middle pages this." Barbara turned the book carefully to a place near its heart. The page she stopped on had a small pen drawing at the top, done in faded brown ink. It showed a low farmhouse with a garden bed running the length of its foundation, and rings of small plants set at intervals around 3 long shapes that Etta, after a moment, recognized as barns or byres. Beneath the drawing ran 3 tight columns of the spidery hand, and besides certain words her mother had penciled English translations in the margins in her own round, careful writing. Tansy, wormhood, rue, pennyroyal. Your great-grandmother's people kept cattle in a valley where the winters were long and the barns had to be closed up for 4 months at a stretch, Barbara said. And in barns that are closed up with warm animals crowded together and hay stored overhead, other things live too. Flies, lice, mites in the hay, mice in the grain, ticks that come in on the cattle in the fall and never leave. In a hard winter, those small things kill more cattle than the cold does. Not all at once, slowly. A cow bled thin by lice does not have the reserve to fight a lung fever. A calf whose hay is full of mouse droppings takes sick and does not recover. A herd crowded into a barn where flies have wintered in the rafters passes pink eye from one animal to the next until half of them are blind. Etta was very still. "And these plants," she said, "do something about that. They do a great deal about that. The oils in them, the smell you get on your hands when you crush a leaf, that is what the insects cannot bear. Mice will not nest where pennyroyal grows against a foundation. Flies will not lay in hay stored above wormhood. Ticks drop off a cow that has walked through tansy at the pen gate. It is not magic, Etta. It is only that these plants have been doing this in that valley in Bavaria for 400 years, and the women who kept the barns there wrote it down. Then why doesn't everybody know it?" Barbara looked at the page for a long moment. "Because," she said quietly, "the people who knew it were mostly women and mostly poor and mostly spoke a language nobody here bothers to learn." Etta was quiet a long time after that. The stove ticked as it cooled. Somewhere out in the yard, one of the dogs got up, turned around twice and lay back down with a heavy sigh. Barbara did not close the book. She let her daughter look at it, at the small, careful drawing of the Bavarian farmhouse with its rings of green around the byres, at the columns of spidery script beside her own pencil translations. She watched Etta's finger trace one of the English words in the margin. Pennyroyal. Then another. "Rue, Mama," Etta finally said. "Did Papa know about this book?" Barbara had been waiting for the question, and still it took her a moment to answer. "Yes," she said. "Your father knew." "Did he read it?" "He couldn't. The German was past him. But I read pieces of it to him once in the second winter we were married, when the barn out at the old place in Ohio had gotten so full of mice that we lost half the seed corn. I told him what Grossmutter had written about pennyroyal along a granary wall. I showed him the drawing. I asked him if I might try it in the spring." Etta waited. "And your father," Barbara said, "laughed at me. Not cruelly. He was not a cruel man, whatever else he was. He laughed the way a man laughs when his wife has said something he finds tender and foolish at the same time. And then he told me to put the book away, and that if I insisted on keeping it, I was to keep it somewhere he did not have to look at it, because it embarrassed him that his wife believed in what he called old-world nonsense. He said, and I remember his exact words, Barbara, "No man in Ohio is going to plant weeds around his barn on the say-so of a dead German woman. So you put it in the flour tin." I put it in the flour tin, 11 years ago this October. And I did not open it again while your father was alive. Etta looked up. Her face had gone very still in the way that meant she was working something out that had a weight to it. "He told you to burn it." "He did. I told him I had. That was the only lie I ever told your father, and I told it the same night he told me to burn the book. I said, 'Yes, Frank, I'll put it in the stove tomorrow.' And in the morning I wrapped it in oilcloth and I put it in the flour tin, and I never spoke of it again for 11 years. Etta thought about this for a long moment. Then she said in a voice quite small, "Are you angry at him?" Barbara looked at her daughter. She thought about the question honestly, the way the question deserved. "No," she said finally. "Your father was a good man in most of the ways a man can be good. He worked hard. He was kind to you children. He loved me in his fashion. But he could not bear the idea that his wife knew a thing he did not know and had learned it from women he did not respect. That was the shape of him, and it was not a shape I could change by arguing. So I did not argue. I put the book away. And I waited." "Waited for what?" Barbara was quiet a moment. Then she reached across the table and closed the book gently and rested her hand on the worn brown cover. "For a winter," she said, "that I had to face alone. The first snow came on the 8th of November, a thin gray dusting that blew in from the northwest before dawn and was mostly gone by noon." Barbara stood on the porch with a cup of coffee gone cold in her hands and watched it settle in the low places, along the north side of the corral posts, in the shallow of the wagon ruts, against the base of the herb borders where the pennyroyal had already turned brown and woody with the frost. Beneath the withered stems, the smell was still there. She had gone down at first light and crushed a leaf between her fingers to be sure. The oils were in the roots now. They would stay in the soil all winter, and the mice would know it long before any human nose could. By the middle of November, the herbs above ground had died back entirely. To a rider passing on the county road, the borders looked like nothing at all now, just strips of dead brown weeds that a sensible woman would have cleared with a hoe. George rode past them twice a day without comment. The two younger hands, Pete and Danish, had stopped mentioning them altogether, which Barbara understood was its own kind of comment. Only Samuel, her 7-year-old, still walked the borders every morning on some errand of his own, prodding at the frozen ground with a stick and reporting back to her at the kitchen table whether the pennyroyal had come up any further overnight. She had told him it would not, that it was sleeping. He accepted this with the grave professionalism of a boy who has been given a real job. The cattle came down off the North Range on the 22nd, 90 head brought in over 3 long cold days by George and the two hands, and a neighbor's boy hired on for the drive. Barbara stood at the pen gate and counted them through herself, one hand on the top rail, her breath making short white plumes in the air. 90 head. Every one of them accounted for. George had brought them in fat, or as fat as Wyoming grass could make a cow by late November, and their coats were thick and clean. Barbara noted, and did not say aloud, that as each animal passed through the gate it walked directly over a band of dead tansy stems worked into the dirt of the threshold. Every hoof, every leg, every belly hair that brushed the frozen ground picked up the residue of the oils she had planted there in August. She had put tansy at every gate. Not by accident. That night at supper, George sat at the far end of the kitchen table with his plate and did not look at her for the first quarter of the meal. He ate the way a man eats when he is turning something over in his mind. Finally, when Etta had cleared his plate and gone to fetch the pie, he set his coffee cup down and spoke. "Mrs. Halstead," he said, "I've been on cattle in this country 22 winters. I have never in my life brought a herd off the North Range in November without pulling 4 or 5 ticks off the ears of every third animal." Barbara waited. "I pulled 2 ticks," George said, "all week, off the whole herd." He was looking at her now, not with understanding, not yet, with the beginning of the question that comes before understanding. "I don't know what to make of that," he said. "No," Barbara said quietly. "I don't imagine you do, not yet." She poured him more coffee, and neither of them said anything else about it. December came in hard and stayed hard. By the second week the ground was frozen to a foot deep, and the wind had begun the long, steady work it does in that country between Christmas and Easter, blowing day and night out of the northwest with a low, mean whistle that got into the seams of a house and stayed there. Barbara kept the herd close, in the 3 pens south of the barn where the windbreak of cottonwoods took the worst of it off, and she kept the hay barn shut tight against the cold. Twice a week she and Samuel walked the length of the hay barn together with a lantern, and she showed him how to look for what she was looking for. Mouse droppings on the boards, small dark trails in the loose chaff along the walls. The kind of quiet damage that a rancher does not notice until his cattle begin to cough in February. There was nothing to find, not a dropping, not a trail. The pennyroyal she had worked into the dirt along the foundation of the hay barn in September had done its work through the fall, and whatever mice had thought about wintering in the Halstead hay had gone elsewhere, into the Winch barn a mile east or the Lindqvist place across the creek, where the hay was warm and the walls smelled only of hay. She did not mention this to George. She did not need to. George had begun, quietly, to notice things on his own. He had noticed that the cattle in the south pens were not scratching themselves raw against the rails the way cattle usually did by mid-December, when the lice populations that had ridden in on their coats in October began to bloom in the warmth of a crowded pen. He had noticed that the flies which normally hung in a slow black cloud around the water troughs even in cold weather, hatched from eggs laid in the wet straw of the previous summer, were simply not there. He had noticed, walking the barn one afternoon with a piece of cracked harness in his hand, that the air inside did not smell the way a full hay barn in December is supposed to smell, of hay and dust and the Swedish undernote of mouse. He said none of this to Barbara. He said it once in a low voice to Pete Malle while they were mending a stretch of rail together on a cold, gray afternoon. Pete had looked at him a long moment and said, "Well, George, maybe the widow ain't as touched as we thought." And George had said nothing at all and gone back to the rail. The valley, meanwhile, was having a different December. Word came down through the Crossroads store at Sundance that the Winch outfit had lost a heifer to lung fever the first week of the month, and then 2 more the week after. Old man Lindqvist across the creek had a bull go down with something he could not name, staggering in circles in the pen before it fell, and by the time Lindqvist got out with a rifle, the bull had bitten its own tongue nearly through. The Ellery place north of the river was fighting an outbreak of pink eye in its calving pen, and had already lost the sight of one eye in 4 young animals. None of it was catastrophic yet. December losses on a Wyoming ranch were a fact of life, absorbed into the accounting the way a shopkeeper absorbs a certain amount of breakage. But the shape of it was already there if a man knew how to look. Sick animals in crowded pens, warm bodies, warm hay, warm barns, a pathogen bomb ticking down toward whatever weather February chose to bring. February brought the storm. It came out of the northwest on the evening of the 9th, a wall of low gray cloud that the old-timers in the valley had been watching for 2 days without saying much, and by midnight the wind had risen to a scream, and the snow was coming sideways across the flats in dense white sheets that took the world down to nothing beyond arm's length. It blew for 3 days without stopping. On the second day, the temperature fell to 28 below at the thermometer nailed outside Barbara's kitchen window, and on the third day the wind rose again, and the drifts along the north side of the barn climbed to the eaves. When it finally broke on the morning of the 12th, the sun came up on a valley that looked as though it had been buried and abandoned. Nothing moved on the roads for 2 more days after that. Barbara did not sleep much during the storm. She sat up nights at the kitchen table with the almanac open in front of her, reading the same pages she had read 100 times, and listening to the wind pull at the eaves, and to the deep, steady breathing of her children in the loft above her. Twice each day, in the worst of it, she and George bundled themselves into every wool garment they owned and made the walk from the ranch house to the pens, a rope tied between them at the waist, to break the ice on the water troughs and to look at the cattle. The cattle were crowded in against the windbreak, packed shoulder to shoulder, steaming in the cold, their coats crusted with snow. They looked terrible. They looked the way cattle always look in a Wyoming February. They were not, as far as Barbara could see, sick. On the morning of the 14th, when the drifts had settled enough that a horse could get through them, George saddled up without being asked and rode east to the Winch place to see what the neighbors had lost. He was gone the whole day. He came back after dark with his face gone gray under the sunburn, and he sat down at Barbara's kitchen table without taking his coat off and put his hat on the table beside him, which he had never done before in his life. "Ellery Winch," he said, "has lost 41 head." Barbara set a cup of coffee down in front of him and did not speak. "Not to the cold. To the cold he lost maybe 6. The rest went down to lung fever in the barn during the storm. It moved through them like fire through dry grass. He said by the second night he could hear them coughing over the wind. He couldn't get to half of them. When he finally did, they were already down." George took a swallow of the coffee. His hand was not entirely steady. "Lindqvist has lost 22. Old man Coombs across the ridge has lost 38. The Ellery cousins up north, I don't know yet, but the rider who came through said they were burning carcasses this morning." He looked up at her. "Mrs. Halstead," he said, "I walked our pens before I rode out this morning, and I walked them again just now. I have not found one sick animal, not one. I have found 2 dead, and they were the old cow with the bad leg and that yearling that never did thrive, and both of them went from the cold, not from anything else. 2 head, out of 90, in the worst February any man in this valley remembers." He put both hands flat on the table. "Ma'am," he said, "how did you know?" Barbara did not answer him right away. She got up from the table instead and crossed the kitchen and knelt down in front of the flour tin in the corner. George watched her without moving. She lifted the lid, reached past the flour, and drew out the small oilcloth bundle she had drawn out for Etta 4 months before. She brought it back to the table and set it down between them. "I did not know, George," she said. "A woman who came before me knew." She unwrapped the oilcloth. She opened the book to the page with the small pen drawing of the Bavarian farmhouse and the rings of green around the byres, and she turned the book so that it faced him across the table. George leaned forward. He could not read the spidery German script any more than Frank had been able to, but he could read the drawing. He could read the English words Barbara had penciled in her round hand beside the German ones. Tansy, wormhood, rue, pennyroyal. He could see in the small, careful lines of the sketch exactly what he had been walking past every day since August without understanding what he was looking at. He looked at the drawing for a long time, then he looked up. "This is your grandmother's." "My grandmother's, yes, Katharina Roos, from a village in the mountains south of Munich. She wrote it before she died in 1849. My mother brought it across in the winter of '52 in a trunk with a broken hinge. She gave it to me the day I married Frank." George nodded slowly, still looking at the page. "And Mr. Halstead," he said. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. "Frank told me to burn it, George. The second winter we were married. He said no man in Ohio was going to plant weeds around his barn on the say-so of a dead German woman. I told him I would burn it. I did not. I put it in the flour tin. It stayed there 11 years. George was quiet. "I am telling you this," Barbara said, "because you asked me a straight question and you deserve a straight answer. I did not do this by cleverness. I did it because a woman 4 generations back of me did the work and wrote the work down, and her daughter carried the work across an ocean, and her daughter's daughter kept it in a flour tin through a marriage in which it was not welcome. That is all. There is no more mystery to it than that." George looked down at the book again. He touched the edge of the page very carefully with one blunt finger, the way Etta had touched it in October. When he spoke, his voice was low. "Mrs. Halstead," he said, "there are men in this valley right now who are looking at 40 and 50% of their herds gone. Ellery Winch has 3 children and a mortgage worse than yours. Old man Lindqvist is 71 years old, and this is going to finish him. Coombs has a son-in-law who came out here from Iowa 2 years ago on the promise of taking over the place, and by spring that boy is going to have nothing to take over. He looked up at her. "Would you teach them?" he said. "Would you teach any of them who came and asked?" Barbara looked at him across the table for a long moment. Then she closed the book gently and rested her hand on the worn brown cover the way she had done in front of Etta. "George," she said, "I would teach every one of them who came and asked, and I would teach their wives first." They came in ones and twos through the last weeks of February and into March, riding down the frozen ruts of the county road with their hats in their hands. Ellery Winch came first, 3 days after George rode to him with the news, and he stood in Barbara's yard for a full minute before he could bring himself to knock at the door. Barbara made him coffee and sat him at the kitchen table and opened the book in front of him the same way she had opened it in front of George. Winch was a proud man and a hard one, and he did not weep at her table, but his hands shook around the cup and he did not look up from the page for a long time. When he finally spoke, he asked her, in a voice gone rough, whether she would come out to his place in the spring and walk his pens with him and show him where the borders ought to go. Barbara said she would. She said she would bring cuttings from her own beds when the ground thawed, and she would not charge him a cent for them, and he was to bring his wife when she came, because his wife was the one who would be tending the plants once they were in. Old man Lindqvist came the following week. He was too proud to come alone, and so he brought his granddaughter Ingrid, who was 15 and spoke better English than he did, and he sat in Barbara's kitchen with his cap on his knees and let the girl ask the questions. Coombs came after that, and then the Ellery cousins from the north, and then a rancher named Peterson from clear over the ridge whom Barbara had never met. She sat each of them down at the same table. She showed each of them the same page. She did not hide the book. She did not pretend the knowledge was hers. She said, each time, "My grandmother wrote this down in a village in Bavaria, and my mother carried it across the ocean, and I kept it in a flour tin for 11 years because my husband told me to burn it." She said it plainly, and she watched their faces when she said it, and not one of the men who came to her table flinched away from the telling. They had lost too much that winter to flinch at anything anymore. By April the ground had thawed enough to work, and Barbara spent the better part of 6 weeks riding from ranch to ranch with cuttings wrapped in wet burlap in the back of the buckboard, and Samuel on the seat beside her. She showed the wives where the pennyroyal wanted to go, close against the foundation of the hay barn where the mice came in. She showed them the tansy at the pen gates, so that every hoof passing through would carry the oils. She showed them the wormhood beneath the eaves, and the rue in the tight bands around the calving sheds. She spoke mostly to the women. The men listened from a few steps back, with their hats in their hands, and when they had questions they asked them through their wives, which was a courtesy Barbara noticed and did not remark upon. The almanac came out of the flour tin that spring, and it did not go back in. Barbara set it on a shelf in the kitchen, above the stove where the warmth would keep the pages from damp, and she left it there for the rest of her life. Etta took it down after her mother was gone, and Etta's daughter after that, and the borders in that valley are still green to this day. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more tales of the forgotten women who kept the frontier alive. Tell us in the comments whose knowledge in your own family was almost lost, and who was brave enough to keep it.